Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to chief audit executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Well, hi everybody, I'm Jason Mefford, and I am pleased to be talking to Rick Wright today. And Rick is the Chief Audit Executive of YRC Worldwide, which is a transportation company based in Kansas City, Missouri. And I'm excited to talk to Rick because I talked with him before and found out he is writing a book on Agile Auditing. And I know this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in. And so just want to really kind of jump in and get started with it. So Rick, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's, when I first heard the term Agile Auditing, I kind of thought, okay, I know what Agile is, right? Because IT has been using this methodology for a while, but it's really kind of about project management, right? And so at first I thought, well, why would we be doing that as auditors? And then as I got to thinking about it, it makes total sense, right? So maybe just kind of explain to people what's kind of the 30,000-foot view of what Agile Auditing is, and then we can start kind of talking about how that means, what that means for us in changing and how we do audits going forward.
Sure. I think one of the first things that you need to do when talking about the subject of Agile Auditing is, define what do we mean by Agile Auditing. I think within the internal audit community, people have a lot of different ideas about what that actually means. So you have kind of the one, camp where Agile Auditing is, being more nimble, being able to address risk more timely and more relevant fashion, and really about, how to audit in a more lean manner, more efficient, really just doing audit better. That's kind of one line of thinking about what Agile Auditing means. The other camp of Agile Auditing, and the one that I'm focused on, is utilizing the Agile software development methodologies and values and principles that are outlined in the manifesto for Agile software development, and using that structure and kind of retrofitting the audit process around that structure. And what I'm finding is I'm writing my book and researching and implementing Agile in my own audit function is that Scrum methodology, which is an Agile software development methodology, is kind of the methodology of choice for building this Agile auditing process and approach around. So that's kind of the first, I think, distinction and information that you need when you're talking about and learning about Agile Auditing is just, what do we mean?
Yeah.
So hopefully that gives a little bit of color around that. The second part is really around a mindset shift related to how you approach an internal audit. The traditional waterfall approach where you have a planning phase and where that encompasses really planning out the entire path of the audit up front, and then going through a field work or execution phase. When that's complete, going through a review and reporting stage, and then finally closing and wrapping up the audit. That is kind of the traditional way that audit's been done. With Agile, you're really looking at it from a very different mindset approach. So it's a very much more of a collaborative, a lot of value seen in collaboration between audit clients and the audit team. So whereas in traditional audit approaches, there's more of a, I guess, kind of an arm's length type of relationship that's really inherently built into that process. With Agile, the audit client really is invited more to be a part of the audit team. So there's a very different mindset around how the relationship with the audit client is established and managed throughout the project. There's also, just the flow of the audit is very, very different. Instead of planning everything up front, like it's done in the traditional approach, in Agile, the work is done on a more iterative, incremental basis. So you work in time-boxed work cycles referred to as sprints, and they can run anywhere from a week long to 4 weeks long, but that time frame is set. And within that, there is a distinct planning, execution, review, and reporting phase. So it's just, in some regards, a little bit like a mini audit, but it's very, very focused on the activities that will be performed in that particular time box work cycle. And then when that is complete, then the next cycle starts, and that planning, execution, review, reporting process continues throughout the audit until the objectives of the audit are achieved. So that is kind of in a nutshell the approach and how we define Agile auditing, at least how I'm defining Agile auditing.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think, there were a couple of really important points that you brought up there because, first, let's just talk about the meaning for a little bit, because, I see this a lot when I'm talking to people about different things, especially things like risk management, where there's so many different understandings or levels of what risk management is that a lot of times you're just completely talking about two different things. And so, like you said, Agile auditing, some people see it as, well, I'm more nimble, I'm more fast, in how I'm doing it, versus others that are looking at, no, Agile auditing is actually using, right, this methodology. And those are two different things, because one group might say, well, yeah, I'm Agile in my auditing because I don't have a 3-year locked in plan, right? But that's not really Agile processes put into place, right? So I can see where there's some maybe misunderstanding of some departments might say, yeah, we're doing Agile, but they're only thinking of it in like being nimble, versus you, where you're actually utilizing and incorporating the actual methodology, right? And I love, like you said, Scrum is probably the most popular, and I love that term anyway, just because I'm kind of, I think they have, isn't it, Scrum Master? And I thought, man, that would be like a great certification to get, So yeah, I mean, there is kind of this difference between the two, right? And so how do we, if you're actually using the methodology, like you said, I think there's some fundamental differences in how we do the audit, right? So under an Agile method, how do you do, for example, annual planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from, a risk assessment standpoint, that process is, I don't know that it changes a whole lot. You still, with an Agile methodology, you still do risk assessment, and you can do that according to your normal cadence that you do it. If it's an annual process, you can that works within the Agile framework. If it's a more frequent time frame, that works also. I think the distinguishing factor there is, and every organization is going to be a little bit different in how they execute that. But with Agile, generally what I have seen is that organizations have a much shorter time frame of their audit plan. So I've seen kind of a 3+9, where 3 months worth of the audit plan is scheduled out, and you know what you're going to be working on for that 3-month period. And then there's a 9-month kind of backlog of other potential audit projects, but you don't know if those are going to be projects that you actually get to or not when that 3-month kind of set audit plan is complete, then you create the next 3 months. So it's that 9 months is kind of a trailing audit plan, and it is refreshed on essentially a 3 month timeline. And that's kind of how I think organizations tend to think through the Agile auditing audit plan, not in the traditional annual process, but more in a kind of rolling, tentative type of audit plan. So that allows an organization to be a little bit more nimble, allows an organization to be more relevant in the projects that it selects based off of risks that the organization is facing at the current time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is, that I think is one of these mindset shifts, because, traditionally in audit, like you said, we'd create an annual audit plan. Some departments would actually do a 3-year plan. So not only did they plan kind of the first year, but for some rotational or other things like that, what they were expecting to do, in the second and third year. And as businesses change, because I remember being in a group with, I think it was at one of the conferences that I was at, and some people from Google were talking, and about how they do their planning. And like you said, it's kind of like this 3+9 that you just mentioned. And I remember the person from Google saying, we can't create a year-long plan because we have no idea what our business is going to look like even 3 months from now. And so for them to try to get locked into, for sure what they're going to do for the whole year wasn't possible for them. And I almost think it's really not possible for everybody, but it's a big mindset shift in going, like what you might analogize to an annual budget process to doing a rolling forecast. And I think that's kind of what I'm hearing you saying. Is that kind of right? Where we create more like a 3-month forecast with some ideas of what the next 9 months might be, but those are going to change as we maybe get to the end of the 3 months.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good analogy to go with there. And I think most audit functions, most contemporary audit functions now are even doing, an audit plan. They might, create an annual plan of projects. So I think most organizations are on a either quarterly or biannual, and some even more frequent than that, doing some form of refresh, whether you're using Agile or not. I think most organizations have gotten to the point now where they are doing some kind of a refresh of their audit plan throughout the year, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But the Agile framework, the Agile process really lends itself well to a more dynamic type of audit plan as opposed to static.
Well, and as you've kind of transitioned there in your organization, because one of the things that I hear from people is kind of a pushback sometimes is they say, well, the standards kind of say we're supposed to do an annual plan. I can't even remember off the top of my head if it says annual or if people are inferring that. And the audit committee is used to us presenting our annual plan. So how does that change, going forward? And were there any discussions that you had with your audit committee where they were like, well, we want to know what you're going to do for the whole year? Or, was that an easy transition to make, to say, look, this is really what we're going to focus on for 3 months. We think we're going to do these other things, but don't hold us to it. What was kind of that transition that you had as you've been making this change?
So for us, that transition wasn't difficult because even before we started doing Agile, that was our mindset with our plan. And, part of the beauty of the standards for internal auditing is that they're principles-based. They're not prescriptive. So you can present an annual plan if that's what you want to do, but there's nothing that says that has to be a static, mandatory, you have to do these projects in your annual plan. So there's, the principles-based nature of audit standards provides a lot of discretion for the audit function and how they want to maneuver around that annual plan that they put together, if indeed it is an annual plan.
Okay. Well, and then let's so the that's kind of from an annual planning perspective. Now let's think about it from the engagement level, because again, I think this is where some of the bigger changes are, and brings in, like you talked about, more collaboration with the audit client, where traditionally that may not have been the case, but I personally think that's really important. And this methodology allows more collaboration and really partnering with the management team. Um, but how does it look different now on the engagement level? And where I'm going to go from is, a lot of people, and I remember I sent one of my when I was a chief audit executive, I remember sending one of my staff people to a training, and she came back and said, well, the instructor said every engagement is supposed to be 4 weeks, 1 week of planning, 2 weeks of field work, 1 week of wrap up. And even then I was like, no, that's not how you do it, right? It's not. Every audit is 4 weeks. There's a planning phase, there's a doing phase, there's a wrapping up phase, but it's not 4 weeks. But I think tradition, a lot of people still kind of think in some of that kind of a mindset, right? That we're going to spend a certain fixed time doing planning up front. And maybe in traditional, that was much more time than what it is now under an agile approach. So how does, maybe explain a little bit about how does an engagement look when you're doing it under the agile methodology?
Right. So with Agile, and not to say that collaboration hasn't been a part of the audit process. Collaboration is always part of the audit process, whether you're using an Agile methodology or more of a traditional methodology. I think the distinction is that with Agile auditing, collaboration is built into the design, so it is inherently a part of the project and the process. Mm-hmm. By definition within Agile. So to me, that's kind of a distinguishing characteristic there. But in terms of how an Agile audit looks kind of from a process standpoint and how it's different, it's much more iterative. So, we've all done audits and gone through the planning and felt like we've had a rock solid plan, very well thought out. And it doesn't take too long often to get into the trenches and the field work phase and realize that things come up. You learn new things, mm-hmm. You find new things, and those can sometimes change the whole direction of the audit and make the planning kind of irrelevant at that point in time. So, and you can kind of get stuck. There's a point where you get to, and you're like, wow, we need to go back and do more planning now. Mm-hmm. Well, audit kind of takes that off the table, or I'm sorry, Agile takes that off the table. What we do in Agile is we start with an initial planning phase, and we're not interested in planning out the whole audit. We're more focused on, what's the scope, what are the main themes of the audit, the general objectives that we want to achieve out of the audit. And from the business owner standpoint, what are their concerns and what are the issues that are already known? We also want to look at, what's the value that we're going to get out of the audit, make sure we really understand the value proposition of the audit. So we're thinking more high level, more what's the definition of a successful audit here, and not the specifics about how we're going to go out and test and what are the controls that we're going to be focused on. We can learn all that later. Mm-hmm. So that first initial planning is high level. It's an initial plan. The expectation is that the plan is going to change as the project progresses. So that is something that is an expectation that is entered into at the outset of the project. And then once you get past that initial phase, then you go into these time box work cycle elements of the project, again referred to as sprints. And we use 2-week sprints. As I mentioned, typically you're going to see 1 to 4 weeks. But from my experience, most organizations that are doing Agile audit are using 2-week sprints. And so within that 2-week sprint, you have a number of what we call ceremonies in the Scrum world. And ceremonies are just meetings that serve a purpose to help direct the progress of the project. So there's a sprint planning ceremony that is focused on planning out just that 2-week sprint, the work that will be done, and the tasks that will be performed for that. So that is the field work for that 2 weeks. So there is at the end of it, there is a review ceremony where the work that has been done is reviewed to ensure that it meets the goals of that particular sprint, that the work that was done meets established acceptance criteria that has been agreed upon between the audit team and the audit client. And then there is a process for presenting the work that was done, the conclusions that the audit team has reached with the audit client and other stakeholders. And so it's kind of a reporting mechanism. And the value there is that everybody gets on the same page. So the audit client has an opportunity to challenge results of the work at that point in time. It kind of keeps everybody from getting to the end of the audit and realizing, oh, there's a disconnect here. Everybody's on the same page within that 2-week time box, and reporting is done there so that the audit client can go ahead and start working on their responses to any observations, issues, findings that were made in that particular 2-week sprint. So, and then when that sprint is done, that cycle starts up again, and that continues until all of the objectives of the audit are achieved, and then there's a wrap-up phase and a final reporting phase. So that's the difference. You have these ongoing cycles of plan, field work, and reporting that are done in these 2-week increments. And planning can be as new things are learned. You can shift gears, so to speak, not have to try to force a plan that was developed before all these other learnings were made onto the project going forward, or waste that time.
Yeah. Well, and so that brings up a couple of questions for me then too. So just maybe so that the people that are listening can get an idea. Let's from the initial planning. So maybe let's say we'll just call it traditional method, right? Maybe that planning phase took a week or 2 weeks. How much time would an agile initial planning be? I mean, would that be a few days, or would it still be a week? Or how does the time maybe differ under an agile, at least for the initial planning? And then we'll jump more into the engagement here shortly.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. My experience has been that planning in a traditional audit can take a pretty significant amount of the resources within the audit. And what I've experienced in the past, and other organizations and that I've been in with audit groups, is that planning, it can kind of take on a life of its own, and you get to a point where just kind of plan every little detail, and it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
So ideally, that would be a 1 or 2 week process in the traditional audit sense. My experience has been that it can run a little bit over that. With Agile, again, you're focused on just what's the important, what's the most important to get out of the audit project, and what are the main objectives? What are the key, what's the value proposition for the project? Making sure that everyone's on the same page with what the ultimate goal of the audit is to be, and not focused on the details. That's saved for later. So that inherently reduces the time that's needed for that initial planning. The other piece of that is the documentation that is required is significantly less. In our approach and most other organizations that I've benchmarked with Agile Audit, it's a one-page planning document that's created, and it's a very summarized type of format, so it doesn't get into a lot of great detail. Again, it's focused on what really matters in terms of directing, providing some guidance for the overall project without getting into core details of that. So in my experience, getting to your question, that initial plan for an Agile audit, could take a couple of days up to about a week. If you're spending more than that, I would question, are you getting too much into the details, too much into the weeds of the project? You really should be able to plan out, create that initial plan for a project, in a couple of days to a week's worth of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you're talking, it makes, traditionally we would have, yes, we do the planning, we come up with the objectives of the audit, right, and the scope, but then we would start to, like you said, understand what's going on. So we start coming up with the work programs and the everything else, in that initial planning phase often, which is easy for it to go, like you said, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes maybe even 4 weeks, depending on the size of the project. And it starts getting out of control because we're spending all of our time planning and not actually doing the work, right? Which is one of the benefits of Agile. And so to me, it sounds like, kind of what you're saying here is we're not going to get into the details yet in the planning, but we have to be very clear on exactly what the objectives of the audit are. That's the important thing. Then we document them in like this one-page planning document. And then we start doing these sprints to be able to help us then, dig in deeper to make sure that we are accomplishing those objectives. Because as I was listening to you talk about, the sprints and, kind of following the progress and everything else, at first my mind kind of went to scope creep, like, oh, instead of, spending 4 weeks in planning, now we're just going to keep doing these sprint after sprint after sprint after sprint, and never end up accomplishing, the project. But I guess the point is, if you're crystal clear on your objectives when you're planning, then you're going to kind of know when you're done, right?
Right. And that really is, and I don't want to say that there's no detailed planning. There's, some detailed planning. It's just, done, a level higher than what it's done in a more traditional audit. So the general areas that you're going to dive into, but you're not, building test plans and tasks and things like that. But it's a very iterative process by design, and so you do your initial plan, and then once you enter into your sprints, you're doing more micro planning for a particular subset of the work that's going to be done throughout the audit. And coming out of the initial plan, you generally have a sense for the number of sprints that it's going to take to complete the project, because the general areas that are going to be worked on, tested, researched, learned about. So it's very iterative in nature. So you do an iterative plan, you do the work associated with that plan, you do iterative review and reporting, and then you reset. You look at the work that has been done, you look at the learnings that have been made, and then you go back and look at the objectives, and if there's a reset that needs to be done, you have an opportunity to reset at that point. So you're making these kind of micro adjustments to the project as you go along, and in that way you can correct course earlier on in the process instead of getting to the end of the project before you realize that you're way off base off of what was really important in the project, because you didn't know what you didn't know at the beginning.
Well, and that's where I see a lot of the benefit coming from is having those sprints, and like you said, you have these ceremonies, at the beginning or end, and you're reporting more timely, kind of like, again, what we've normally would have talked about is interim reporting on a longer project, but the process forces you to actually do it. Organizations that were doing this anyway, it's not going to be a big surprise, but a lot of times, because it wasn't baked into the process, a lot of times that some of that interim reporting may have not been as formalized as it should be, where this is kind of forcing it to happen, right? So I can see that as being a really positive, because like you said, if you don't get down the road 4 or 5 weeks and realize that you just wasted half of that time. You're because it's iterative, you're able to change and modify what you're doing as you're going through, which can have some huge time savings, but also more effective if you're focused more on making sure that the objectives are done instead of a big work program that you developed in an earlier phase. Everything's ticked off, right? Because like you said, as you get into the project, we all know this. This happens every time. No matter how good you plan up front, you get into the project and you find out things, and so then stuff changes, right? And this is just kind of helping to systematize some of that as you're going through. Excuse me. So with this, then I guess with more kind of interim reporting, how does that change maybe the way, or does it change the way that the final audit report is actually issued?
So that's a great question. The iterative nature of how the project is completed does allow for interim reporting. Allows the audit client to start crafting their responses and their action plans, and to potentially even complete a remediation effort or complete a response to a particular risk that's identified or not being managed as effectively as it could be. So ideally, as the sprints are completed, as the observations are being communicated, that report is kind of building off of itself. So after sprint 1, you have, a piece of the report that is essentially done. After sprint 2, you have another piece of that. So you have, kind of a report that you start with, and as the project goes, just build onto that based off of the, work that is done throughout the various sprints, so that when you get to the end of the audit, the last sprint, you should have a report that is more or less done, including action plans, which, as we all know, a lot of times can be one of the most time-consuming aspects of wrapping up an audit, is getting the action plans from the audit client. And working through those. So the process helps to make that the reporting more efficient, and helps the audit client to also kind of keep pace with that, and not have to work on their action plans at the end of the project. They can be working on that throughout the project as the project progresses. So from a reporting standpoint, there's a lot of efficiency that can be gained, and there's it creates a much more timely response. So I'm sure we've all had audit projects that have lingered on, perhaps longer than they should have lingered on, and you get to the end of it, and some of the observations that you made are no longer relevant even. Because other changes that have happened in the business. This prevents that from happening, and it allows a more immediate response to risk. So there's not a risk that's hanging out there that the company continues to be exposed to. Management will go ahead and start working on responses to those.
Yeah. Well, and I like that, because like you said, from the action plan, if you're touching base or kind of connecting in with people, throughout these sprints, it allows management to start working on the action plan before you get to the end of the audit, which is great. Because one of the things I always like to do is, in our final report, I love to be able to say something like this, right? there's 10 or 20 different things that the client's trying to do, and 5 of those were done and completed before we even issue the report. Right. And so it allows, that would kind of give them kudos to management of, hey, this group is on top of it. They've actually fixed these problems before the report even got issued. And so it would allow more of that kind of, I guess, positive reinforcement, because you're giving them time to work on it. You've already agreed on it. You're not fighting about it, at the end in a closing meeting, and then you're rushing off to get on a plane or whatever else, right? And then you're trying to deal with some of the inefficiencies of working through some of those things on phone calls or emails as well. So yeah, and I like that idea that if you're doing this right and following the methodology, you're actually writing your report as you go along. So when you get to the end, report writing shouldn't be this huge ordeal like it has been in the past. So that sounds great. So, just a couple quick things then here too that kind of tie into this, and then we'll try to wrap up. But was trying to think too, as far as the auditors on your team, and because again, we said this is kind of a mindset shift, and so what things have you had to do maybe to kind of prepare your team to switch and kind of follow into this new agile mindset and methodology?
Another great question. So what I typically find with organizations is that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, there's some auditors, audit staff that are a little hesitant, that they wonder about conforming with standards, and those are all really, really good things to make sure that are covered. And then you have the kind of the other side of the house where people love change and love trying new things, and this is kind of invigorating for them. So there's a change management piece that goes into this, as it goes into any kind of organizational change. You need to recognize that some people are going to be uncomfortable with this and help them through that. Agile does not contradict standards. Agile, still checks all the boxes with internal auditing standards, so there really isn't any concern. There are differences in how standards are conformed with. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, there's nothing about Agile audit that is in conflict with standards. So it's a matter of convincing the staff, showing them how standards can still be complied with in this new way of doing audits. Another thing that's really important and a big change with Agile is there is a huge trust component that is built into it, and it comes from the values and principles of Agile methodology. And so there's this idea of self-governing and self-organizing teams within the Agile framework. So the audit team really is the group that dictates how the audit work gets done. You don't have an audit manager, an audit director, chief audit executive dictating to the audit team how the work is going to get done. You set the objectives, you identify the value proposition, you outline the components of work that need to get done, and then you let the audit team do the work, and you let them do it the way that they think is the best way to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's just a free-for-all. Obviously, there's checkpoints and places where work gets reviewed and things like that. But as the work is taking place in sprints, the audit team are the ones that are determining how that work is going to get done, how that objective is going to be achieved, how that value proposition is going to be realized. And that's, for a lot of people, that is a refreshing approach, but it does take some getting used to, being empowered to that extent. And there are some people that really embrace that, and there are other people who, like more structure and like, more being kind of told what to do along the way. That is another aspect of change that needs to be managed in the project. But as far as the audit staff and preparing them for the transition, those are probably the two biggest things that I would say. Most organizations that I've talked with, and even with my own organization, once they get into the sprints and they get through kind of the initial learning about the process, they really embrace it. They really enjoy working this way much more than the traditional model. And once they've done a couple audits, they're sold, and they never want to go back to the traditional way of doing audits again.
Yeah, well, which I think is interesting because, like you said, it does require more of this self-managed, self-governing, kind of mentality, which again has not traditionally been there in audit, right? I mean, we've tended to be very hierarchical, even in the staffing of the engagement, right? You've got to, maybe you need a couple of staff people and one senior and one manager and then the CAE, right? And so there's kind of this hierarchy of, getting the approvals and, the reviews and all that kind of stuff, where now we're turning much more of that over into these self-managed teams, which goes with human behavior as far as how most people would prefer to work. Like you mentioned, though, there are some people that prefer to be told what to do instead of being self-managed. And so you have to kind of draw them out to that. But especially younger generations seem much more willing to and wanting of kind of this self-managed type of an arrangement anyway. So I guess kind of a follow-on question on that is, does that end up then changing kind of the structure of who is in the audit department, the level of people in the audit department going forward? Because if we kind of move away from the traditional hierarchical, I've got 3 staff people and 1 senior and a manager on an engagement, how does that maybe look going forward? And does that mean we're going to have to change kind of the structure of our departments?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think it's something that audit groups that have implemented Agile are wrestling with right now, because it does change the hierarchy. It makes it a much flatter organization within the Scrum framework. There are essentially 3 roles. There's a product owner role, which oftentimes is the audit client, but sometimes it can be an audit kind of leader role. And then there is a Scrum Master, which serves as sort of a project manager. They are a person who is very familiar with Scrum methodology, and their purpose is to ensure that the audit team essentially stays true to the Scrum methodology, that they work through the ceremonies that are required of Scrum, that they follow the methodology essentially, and they're also there to ensure that any impediments or blockages that come up within the project are dealt with. And then there's the audit team, and the audit team consists of the audit staff, and even clients can be part of the audit team. They are the ones that are going to be doing the actual work of testing and what we would traditionally view as the field work, and they're participating in planning activities up front as well. But it does kind of challenge the traditional model of staff auditor, senior auditor, audit manager, audit director, chief audit executive. It challenges that hierarchy and how that works. And I think that again that is a question that audit shops that are doing Agile are still working through and trying to figure out how to address going forward. As far as from a competency standpoint, one of the things that I've had to think through with my team is, it is because of the self-governing nature of it. You need individuals who are comfortable in that type of environment, that are very creative, very good critical thinkers, problem solvers. And I've also found that the soft skills are really, really important. Not that they aren't in the traditional sense. Obviously they are, but those soft skills really come into play just because it is by design a collaborative exercise, both with the audit team members and with the audit client as well. So those soft skills become very important. I have found that some process improvement background is really good, because Agile does lend itself to consulting projects very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so that skill set is important. It lends itself to data analytics as well. So that skill set, I think, is heightened even more than it already is. Obviously, the traditional, audit skills are still important, but I think it does change a little bit the makeup of the competencies that you're looking for along the lines of what I just outlined.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there are changes that are going to be coming. And like you said, companies that are going down this path don't have all the answers yet, but, starting to make some inroads there, because like you said, I mean, and I've seen this over and over again, that the importance of these soft skills is even more important now than it's ever been. Because it's hard to have a self-managed team that's collaborating more frequently with others in the organization if they don't have the soft skills, because it just doesn't work. The relationship issues, you have trouble with, and like you said, I mean, if you think about these three roles, right? The owner, the master, the team, kind of a thing. That again, some of the people on the staff, for example, may need to be trained more in being a Scrum Master, and actually having I'm just kind of spitballing here a little bit, but maybe we hire project managers, right? People with project management skills, maybe a PMP who is, trained in Agile and experienced in being a Scrum Master. Maybe that's a new role that ends up, in the audit departments that historically hasn't necessarily been there, right? To kind of fill some of that position. Who knows, right? We got to learn. It's an iterative process too, right? Transitioning to Agile auditing is also an iterative process.
And some of the organizations that I've benchmarked with, they are, some of them hiring Scrum Masters, and some of them are sending their people to Scrum Master training so that they can function in that particular role. One other thought I had on, the kind of the competencies associated with, the audit staff. I focused more, kind of the staff level people doing the work, but there's also a definite transition that needs to take place in the way that audit leadership thinks about how an Agile audit function should be led and managed, because again, with the self-governing concept, there's a lot of trust that has to go into that. So, the old command and control type of leadership structure really is counterintuitive to how an Agile audit function needs to work. And so audit leadership also needs to go through a transition in the way that they think about, how the organization is managed and how it is led, because there are definitely some dynamics there that kind of turn the hierarchy upside down as well.
Yeah. Well, definitely changes ahead, and both in the competencies as well as kind of the way that we are doing the audits. But yeah, I think this is one of the concepts that's going to be here in the future. And so, again, if you don't understand Agile, hopefully after listening to this, people at least understanding the concept a little bit more, and now can kind of jump in and try to figure out how to make it work at their organization. So, Rick, thanks for coming on with me. Now, I know we made a little reference to the book that you're writing. Any kind of foreshadowing of that? Any expectations for when that might be available, that we can go out and get your book and read through it?
Yeah, so the targeted date for publication is sometime around July of this year, 2019.
Okay.
We were, and this is a project with the IIA.
Okay.
So the plan was to release at the international conference. So that's kind of what we're shooting for, but we'll see if we can meet that target. Sometime around the July timeframe, it should be available. If it's not, out there will be pre-sales that are going on it. And just as a little bit of how the book is structured, there's a kind of the main part of the book that talks about what Agile is and explains the value proposition and kind of the nuts and bolts of how to execute. And to me, part of what I'm probably most excited about the book is there are 4 case studies of organizations who are actually using this methodology currently, and it goes into kind of the details and the story and the journey that they went through. So readers will be able to kind of step into the shoes of some other folks who have already blazed the trail, so to speak, and it's already faced some of the challenges and gained some lessons learned from their experiences, and so that will be an opportunity to share those with the readers of the book as well. But it's got a very practical side, kind of how-to nuts and bolts, as well as the kind of case for why you should think about doing it as well.
All right. Well, excited. I'm excited to actually get the book and be able to see. And like you said, those case studies are always really helpful for people because, as they're getting ready to embark on it, they can kind of see what other people have done. And I always like that because I'd prefer not to make the same mistakes other people make. Hey, but so excited to have that out. And Rick, thanks again for talking with me today and explaining a little bit more about what Agile auditing is. All right.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. And that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.